Disclaimer. Thanks to PlayStation for providing me with the free review copy of the game used to compile the footage you see in this video. Intro. As a gamer without sight, I can definitely say that I appreciate The Last of Us Part 2. Though its stealthy stylings are not really usually my kind of game, I'm more inclined to a blocking and parrying kind of experience, such as you might see in God of War Ragnarok. I did very much enjoy being able to complete TLOU2, as we will call it from now on its hardest difficulty, namely Grounded, and separately on Permadeath, very light per chapter if you're wondering. The PS4 version combined existing ideas and concepts into a single cohesive package, something that I don't think we'd really seen in terms of accessibility for mainstream titles prior to its release in 2020. The remaster of TLOU2 for PS5, whilst it does bring some fantastic new additions to the table, particularly in the form of No Return, the roguelike mode that I'll come onto a little later, does have a few flaws that mean that even with the amazing work that was put in, both during the development of the original version and this port, it's still not, I'd argue, as accessible or as enjoyable as it could be. Full disclosure, this review was put together using a pre-release build of the PS5 remaster, so there is a possibility that elements I cover in this video could change later down the line with post-launch updates. The feature set. TLOU2 does carry over the accessibility elements present at its original launch, as well as those we come to know from Part 1. And yes, that does include the audio description and speech-to-vibration features, both of which are great to see in an upgrade package like this. The inclusion of DualSense elements, which also encompasses rain haptics, something I personally find very satisfying to get hands-on with, if you'll pardon the pun, mean that this is a very much more immersive experience, to say the least. Couple these additions with the faster than previous generation load times, and I'd say you definitely have the best way to play the game to date. And that's just talking about the general overview. The story experience. The story of TLOU Part 2, for me, is an interesting one. I won't go into spoiler territory or try and break down the character motivations here. There are probably thousands of other creators who've done far longer videos on that in much greater detail. But from my perspective, in replaying the game in its entirety on New Game Plus for this review, I did realise something. Of course, whilst I understood a greater degree of the narrative, thanks to the audio description, there were still key elements of suspense, environmental detail, and story-related content that just aren't covered as a gamer without sight. Why does this make a difference? I've seen a fair few complaints over the years about audio description in games not covering supposedly everything that needs to be clarified, with people feeling let down and disappointed because they don't have a sense of their surroundings, what characters are doing during smaller in-game moments that aren't described, or even during mid-game sequences like QTEs that would actually make the story feel more complete. To put it another way, if you're watching, let's say, a movie, you get all of this information, even if it's just for the sake of enhancing the atmosphere, and it makes for a more fulfilling experience with less gaps for ambiguity and confusion on the part of the viewer, unless of course it's intended by the creators of the film in question. With video games being such an interactive and involved medium, it's arguably only fitting that as time goes on, they should look to evolve and expand their provision of information to elements outside of just the cinematics. Though this lack of information does make certain parts of the game feel void of any clarity, it does appear that Naughty Dog have brought back their narrator from Part 1, and their script feels like it continues onwards directly as well, which is of course fantastic for the sake of the story flow, if nothing else. You don't actually have to have played The Last of Us Part 1 to dive into the story of Part 2 necessarily, though I can't actually vouch for this myself because I did already know the basics of the first game before I jumped in, but it does seem like you get all the information you need from the earliest points in this hours-long narrative if you did decide to go in blind, pun intended, once again, for whatever reason, to the second game in this franchise. Playing through on New Game Plus, as I'd previously stated, was actually great fun here. After all, you get all the upgrades from a previous save that you can import when you start the game, should you have one available of course, and are able to turn on modifiers like infinite ammo and crafting, thus actually cutting down on the time which you would otherwise be spending tediously scavenging the environment for resources. Even playing through the opening combat tutorial was made more fun by the fact that I remembered you could just fire at the infected instead of having to stealth or melee your way through it. Though granted, of course, this is possible irrespective of whether you're running the game on New Game Plus or not. No Return.
20 seconds.
By far the largest extension to TLOU2 is No Return, the roguelike mode that is probably the reason you've picked up this upgrade in the first place, at least judging from a lot of the discourse I've seen. It almost goes without saying that this mode is actually accessible to the same level as the main game, but with one significant improvement. Specifically, you are actually able to cycle between objectives, i.e. where navigation assist will take you, both in and out of combat. This means that you can actually navigate to the trading post, workbench, encounter rewards, and planning board without having to memorize where they are, and also that you can find the safe and capture mode as well as any other elements that might be present, with just a simple swipe of the touchpad, at least on default controls. It would have been great to see this actually implemented into the main game as well, for instance to allow you to choose whether to navigate solely through the main story or hit the side objectives that are scattered about the world as you go through, particularly for those who don't want to spoil that side content or only wish to go through the primary narrative on subsequent playthroughs. That being said, I personally feel that No Return isn't perfect, as much as I really enjoy the short burst style of experience that it offers. Having played titles like Hades that are in the roguelite genre, a slightly different field that probably warrants a whole separate video in itself in terms of the differences between the two, where non-character based upgrades for progression are actually available, like abilities to influence what you get as you go through runs, or new versions of weapons, etc. Things that aren't just encounter types or bosses, at least after a certain point. It was jarring for me to realise that after a while, the main thing I was working towards were weapon skins that actually don't make a difference to my gameplay experience as a gamer without sight. In spite of this though, the mode is certainly a lot of fun and is really where I've spent most of my time in this review. Some frustration points. Most of you might remember that TLOU2 introduced dodging into the franchise, a mechanic we hadn't seen with the strong, sturdy gameplay of Joel in the original or its own PS5 remaster. However, though the new mechanic can make you feel, for lack of a better term, like a badass, the fact of the matter is that more often than not, it can actually get you killed, especially in situations where there are multiple enemies involved or large, highly mobile bosses. Spoilers for No Return follow, please view at your own discretion. There are actually a couple of boss encounters that feature the bloater enemy type, specifically titled Arcade and Garage Bloater. It's actually not the bloaters themselves that are the problem here though, at least not most of the time, but the smaller infected that appear at various points during these battles. Why are these an issue? Because if you get trapped in a corner, the usual tactic of meleeing your way out of a situation doesn't always correctly target an enemy, nor sometimes does dodging actually move you into an area where you can safely run away. What this means in practice though is even if you swing, you won't always connect with a target and be able to thin the numbers out to refocus on the boss itself. Unfortunately, this seemingly is magnified during the latter fight, since as of the time of writing this sentence, I haven't actually been able to best this boss and move on to other ones, which is actually really frustrating for me, since having seen what the other bosses are, I definitely want to take on the Rat King. Wait, who am I kidding? I don't want to take on the Rat King under these conditions, but I at least want the chance to try. Funnily enough, whilst actually putting this script together, I did get to face the Rat King in a daily run and actually beat him on my first attempt, further intriguing me as to why I was stuck on the Garage Bloater so frequently. And no, if you're curious, I didn't unlock the Rat King as a potential boss for future runs just because I beat him, much to my own annoyance. Even in the early game, the chapter simply known as The Horde is a real test of your dodging abilities, but even if you do manage to L1 your way out of the path of onrushing infected, the chances are that you'll still have a traversal problem or two, as you sometimes manage to unintentionally position yourself just outside of the activation range of the points associated with the audio cues. In practice, this means that even if you do hear the cue and hit the correct button, you won't always actually move into the next area and have enemies at your back that will cause you nothing but suffering. Though the navigation assist is very useful in this game and does get you through most areas with relative ease, there were also several instances during my review playthrough where the feature knew where I was trying to get to, but didn't actually take me there without getting me stuck on geometry in the first place. This meant that I had to simultaneously look and move left or right, then try and reorient. At least that was the hope if I didn't get stuck again on whatever was impeding my progress in the first place. Sometimes I even had to move significant distances away, then try and come back to these sticking points to get through wherever it was that I was trying to get to. And that wasn't necessarily confined to small claustrophobic spaces either. As an interesting combat related side note, only being able to pathfind towards enemies using listen listen mode as a gamer without sight means that you can't actually aggressively run towards targets, as you might see in titles like God of War Ragnarok that provide an auto lock-on feature that is maintained even outside of aiming. It may seem like a small addition, but when you want to get an encounter out of the way with quickly, and you know that your melee hits are going to set enemies on fire, it would be great to be able to solve your problems effectively in the manner of the cordyceps by sprinting towards your foes like a runner and just immolating them on contact, especially if that was via a nav assist style mechanic that didn't force you to either be in listen mode or aiming in the first place. Those of you that know me are likely aware of what I've come to term as the principle of information parity, where the information conveyed visually is also disseminated through other channels like audio, haptics, or both. During a section in the latter part of the game involving a sniper, one of the tips on death actually mentions being able to see the reflection in the sniper's scope, or at least something to that effect. The problem? There is no audio cue equivalent, at least not that I could discover, meaning that you actually essentially are running around with less knowledge than a sighted player, particularly frustrating given the sniper's very sharp accuracy even at low levels and unpredictable nature, at least from my personal experience going through this encounter. Finally, with all the information conveyed in things like no return about objectives, items you're picking up, enemies alive, and what wave you're on, to name just a few, it becomes obvious rather quickly that if you're used to faster speech rates, as I am and many others are as well, that the flow of information is really significantly slower than it would be for a sighted player. If the speech could be adjusted, or interrupted at least, to give you the information about what objective you swiped to, at least on default controls once again, then continue with the rest of the informational deluge, it would perhaps be less of an issue. But with no way to change the speed or actually modify the settings of what information comes first in the priority queue, you are still stuck with having to wait until everything's spoken and then try and track to the objective you want to find. The fun bits. All that being said, these could be seen as relatively minor issues, especially in the 30 hours plus of playtime that you might go through in your first run, notwithstanding elements like having to only navigate to items using listen mode as well, which can take a good while, especially when you're still getting used to the systems, how everything works, and hoping that you don't get stuck on doorways and the like as you go through. For me though, as somebody who hasn't picked up the game in months for prolonged sessions, it was great to be able to run around in this world again, utilizing stealth, firepower, and of course accessibility, as well as feeling firsthand the massive improvements in load times. Incidentally, if you do want to see a video comparing the PS4 and PS5 load times for this game running on the same hardware, then do feel free to let me know in the comments below, as well as if you have any other specific videos you'd like to see. It's interesting though, thinking back to when I first played this game in 2020, not knowing what enemies were around corners and playing it like some kind of true survival horror experience. Compare that to now, where I basically remembered most of the enemy placements and was ready for any oncoming clickers, or pretty much anything else that might decide to attack me. The brutal sound design is just as visceral as ever, and the acoustics of various spaces seem to be enhanced here via the reverb, which, whilst it was present in the original, seems to be more dynamic here somehow, though maybe that's just me. The gunplay and firefights are just as back and forth here as you might expect, making you feel like you're in some kind of action movie, with the voice acting complementing the idea that you might be surrounded on all sides, regardless of the difficulty you're playing on. And I probably don't have to say this to all of you, but shotgunning a clicker, or arguably any other enemy that probably doesn't realise you're there before it even spots you, never gets old. Conclusion. Though definitely a worthwhile upgrade over the PS4 original in terms of a port to next generation hardware, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered is also unfortunately a prime example of a release that, even with all the accessibility it has, still needs tightening up to resolve issues that were even present at its original launch all the way back in 2020. However, with the more seamless integration of DualSense features and audio description, as well as content including lost levels and guitar free play that I haven't covered in this video for the sake of time, those that haven't dove into Part 2 previously, and have the means to do so of course, would be missing a trick if they didn't purchase this upgrade. As someone who's put hours into the original game when it released and afterwards, my personal pain points aside, I commend Naughty Dog highly for at least bringing the PS5 edition of this iconic sequel up to the bar set by its remaster of the 2013 classic that kickstarted this franchise. If you like stealth, zombie-style enemies and making things go boom, as well as probably having you question everything about its characters at various points, this this game might just be what you're looking for as a gamer without sight. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered is currently available exclusively on PlayStation 5. If you like what you've seen or have any specific questions you'd like to ask about the game from my perspective and from my playthrough experience, do drop a comment down below. I've been Sightless Combat, thank you very much for watching.